left off, I had profiled my limbs for thickness. We had done one limb with a bandsaw, and one limb I had used a hatchet and draw knife and rasp. So we've got our limbs kind of at a thickness. It's still way too stiff to even bend. So we haven't got to floor tillage stage yet, but we have our profiles done. I narrowed the grip just a little bit, but I still have quite a bit of meat there, so I have some room to wiggle once we get it bending. So today we're gonna take off the bark. To do that, I'm gonna show you a couple different methods. I'm gonna use a cabinet scraper, and I'll also just use a pocket knife to show you how you can do it with just a pocket knife. Before we get started though, I wanted to show you how to sharpen cabinet scrapers. So your cabinet scraper, one edge has a burr on it, and that edge that has the burr on it, that's what does the scraping and the cutting. And so when you sharpen one, the burr will eventually get wore off, and you have to put a new burr on it. And so what you want to do is stick it in a vise. You want to use a pretty fine file. And what you're going to do is you want your file straight on. You don't want it rocking. You want it dead straight, perpendicular to your scraper edge. And then you're going to come along and you're going to file. And what you're doing is putting a new burr on it. But then after the burr is on it, you can feel the burr. It's going to just be on the one side because you're going this way with the file, one direction. So you can feel the burr. Then what you do is you want to roll the burr over. So you take a hardened steel rod. This is actually designed for that, but you could also use like a drill bit shank or any kind of a hard rod. And you're going to put it on here, and you want it at an angle facing down away on the side that has the burr on it, and then you're going to run that rod across, and what that does is it's hooking that burr over, and that's what gives your scraper a cutting edge. So now I'll go on to start removing bark. I'm going to put the bow in the vise and start removing the bark on the back with a cabinet scraper. I've been using these jaw protectors, but if you don't have those, I use like a piece of rubber or even a piece of thick leather will work. You want to pad your bow because you don't want the vise jaws to be tearing up your bow. Your scraper, when you're using your scraper, you're going to set on your piece of wood straight up and down, and then you want to tilt it back slightly towards you. Not really a 45-degree angle, but slightly tilted back. And then you're going to start scraping with it. Sometimes you can switch directions. But you always want that tilt away from the direction that you're scraping. You don't want it straight up and down. You want it tilted in the direction that you're going to be scraping. Now, I want to scrape off the bark until I get down through the cambium layer, which is the you'll have the outer bark, and then there's inner bark, and that inner bark is called the cambium layer. That's where your nutrients are coming up through your tree and putting on the last growth ring. So as soon as I'm through that cambium layer, I'm on a wood that doesn't have sapwood, I'm at a final growth ring. So you can see the color change there. That's where I want to end when I hit this white color. I don't want to go any further. So when I get the gray bark off, then I'm into kind of that tan or that brown layer, and then once I get through that, I'm into the white. And because that's one growth ring, I don't want to cut into this, because if I cut all the way through it, then I've cut through a growth ring, and that violated growth ring is what's keeping your bow from breaking when it's bending. And so you don't want any gouges in that. You don't want it cut through to the next growth ring or anything. So this is important that you don't dig in too deep when you get there. You can leave some of the cambium layer you can kind of leave on there if you want. It gives it kind of a camouflage effect. But you don't want to leave too much of it on there, because once it dries out, it'll just end up coming off anyway when the bow starts bending if you leave too much of it on there. Now some guys, depending upon when the wood was cut, if the wood's cut in the springtime, sometimes the bark will not be attached very well, and it'll just start to peel off or pop off once the wood's dry. And sometimes you can leave it on there, and then as you're bending the bow, when you're tillering it, the bark will pop off, and it'll always pop off or crack off in the place where the bow's bending the most. So it can be used kind of as a tillering guide. But if the bow is cut depending upon when the bow is cut, the bark may not pop off. You might have to scrape it off. So there's with the cabinet scraper. Now you can come in with a pocket knife and do the same thing. So if you don't have a cabinet scraper, same with your pocket knife, you want it angled back just a tiny bit. Scrape off the outer bark, and then when you get into the inner bark, as soon as you see that changing color, that's where you want to stop. And we'll have to see how this bow turns out, because these dark lines are spalting. That's basically caused by decay. Maybe this bark was held moisture a little bit too long and started to decay a little bit underneath the bark, which is so that can degrade the back of your bow and make it not turn out. But serviceberry is pretty tough, and this is I think it'll be all right. White woods, certain woods can withstand. They don't degrade as fast as other woods. Your woods like Osage, even yew wood's pretty rot resistant. But some of your white woods, like your vine maples and serviceberry and stuff like this, you can't, once you cut them, you can't leave them on the ground. That's why you gotta get them up off the ground to drying, because the wood can degrade pretty quickly. Keep working this along, and so this spalting also looks like it may run like my grain might run off the side of the bow a little bit. Serviceberry is notorious for the grain spiraling up the tree. Usually you can see if the bark's spiraling, you can see it on the bark and know if it's spiraling up the tree. This one didn't look, the bark didn't look like it was, but these lines do. These lines look like it might have. So having the grain run off the side of the bow is not ideal. You can get away with it sometimes if it's at a low enough angle. So that's another one. I guess we'll see what happens. Okay, now I'll get going on the other side. How often you have to sharpen your scrapers kind of depends upon how hard a wood you're working on, and of course how good the scraper is. So, which do I prefer, a cabinet scraper or a pocket knife, or some guys will scrape with the edge of the draw knife. It kind of depends upon what you're doing. I use all different methods depending upon where I'm at and what I'm doing. The cabinet scraper is less aggressive than the pocket knife, and so you have less chance of marring up the back of the bow with the cabinet scraper. A pocket knife, because it's such a sharp, straight edge, it'll put gouges in the wood if you're not careful. But kind of dull up your pocket knife eventually. So there's a few philosophies I have on making bows. One is, if you have a specific type of bow you want to make, say you want to make a recurve, short recurve, or you want to make a traditional English longbow, you want to make a flat Indian style bow, wide flat Indian style bow, whatever, if you have a specific type of bow in mind, your best bet is to go find a piece of wood that's best suited to make that style of bow. The other way of doing it is take the piece of wood you have and ask yourself what style of bow is going to make the best bow out of this piece of wood. Certain woods like a wider, flatter design. Certain woods will work better for different styles of bows. So if you just have one piece of wood, try to make the best bow you can out of that piece of wood, even if it's not necessarily the style that you were hoping for. Here in the Northwest, the moisture content, even out here in my shop, is a lot more than other places. I can tell there's moisture in this inner bark. The outer bark crunches right off, but then when I get into this cambium layer, you can tell it's got some moisture. And my handle on here before I take it off. Okay. I'm going to take it off and not be able to know where it is. You can always remeasure it, I guess. So when you're cutting wood and you're going to dry it, how long to dry it is always, here in Western Washington with the climate, about 4 months of air drying is minimum for most any kind of woods, unless you're going to try to artificially speed dry it somehow, but I don't really like doing that. But more like 6 months to a year is more like it in our area. Yew wood, it really benefits from a longer dry time. I consider like around 3 years a minimum for drying yew, and the old timers used to like around 7 years minimum. But the longer the yew wood dries, the kind of the better performance it has, in my experience. I've had some yew wood that was cut in like in the 40s, and it was phenomenal. I think it has to do with the temperature changes from summer to winter, and the humidity changes, and the humidity kind of going in and out of the wood. Back in the day, I've read in some of the old like E. Sylvan archery books that they, if they cut yew wood in the springtime, they would put the logs in a running creek, and they called that washing out the sap, and they would cure it for a certain amount of time in running water. I've never had the chance to really try that to see if it makes a difference or not, but it's kind of interesting that was one of the things that they talked about doing. So around this knot, I probably not gonna be able to get all that with a square scraper. I can use the curve on my knife a little bit to get in there, but it doesn't matter. This is in the handle area, and it doesn't matter if I leave a little bit of the inner bark on here. Okay, so there we got the whole back, all the bark off of the back. So if you can see these lines go off the edge of the bow, even although I followed the crown of the tree, and you know, when we laid it out, I followed the top of the crown of the tree, but that means that this tree, when it grew, had some twist in it. So I don't know how this goes. We got some reflex in it. When I laid it out so the back would have reflex, and that's ideally how you want your bow to be. So yeah, it'll keep string follow down. So next we have to start removing wood on the belly here until we can get this thing to flex. This is called floor tillering. So you'll take the bow and flex it on the floor. You're just trying to get it to where it's kind of bending and kind of bending somewhat evenly. So next I'll be removing wood, checking it, until we get it floor tillered and bending on the floor. Then we'll go to the tillering tree and do the rest of our tillering on the tillering tree. Thanks for watching.